In many ways, I think that we Jews can be obsessed with numbers. And by that, I do not in any way mean finances. We are constantly, I observe, counting ourselves, counting each other. We want to know how many of us there are. How many children do we typically have? How many people are attending such and such an event in the Jewish community? What the Jewish population of Israel is. In fact, I think of the myriad of important topics affecting the Jewish world, the things that we could spend our time talking about as a congregation, as a community, as a people. Things like the treatment of Jews around the world, or what a democratic Jewish state might look like, such as Rabbi Marmer talked about last Shabbat, last weekend. Or how do we observe Shabbat as Reformed Jews in a world that does not rest? And if it does rest, it certainly doesn't do it on Saturdays. All of these important and perhaps productive conversations, we talk about numbers. I think it's probably because there are so few of us in the world, and we know how important each one of us is, and yet I fear that the more we focus on numbers, perhaps the less any of us may feel like he or she counts. The trouble is, when we try to maybe break ourselves of this habit, we have to admit that we come by it naturally. For example, in this week's Torah portion, in the 30th chapter of Exodus, we learn that the Israelites must, of course, take a census. That is, they must count themselves, and when they do this, on the basis of inclusion in that census, because one is counted, an enrollment fee was collected. It was a privilege, apparently, to be counted in the census, and so for that privilege, one would pay a half a shekel. We might ask why being counted in the census was such a privilege that they would want to pay for it. In verse 14 of the chapter, we learn that the ones who were included in the census had to be at least of age 20, and of course male. This may sound arbitrary, 20 years old, a man, but if we consider other ancient Near Eastern cultures and we look at other Israelite literature, we learn that 20 years old was the age that someone was eligible for military service. And that's what caused them to be counted in the census. So how do we interpret this? The census in this week's Torah portion was interested in determining the number of able-bodied Israelite men who could fight for their people if the time came. It might be tempting to dismiss this census then as being really irrelevant. What's the big deal with military age? What's the big deal with just men? But in doing so, we might dismiss the census as having any relevance, and in fact, all we do is take a census all the time of ourselves. So perhaps we should look to this census to learn something about how we should count. I believe that that 20-year-old military age detail is purely circumstantial, and here's why. Judaism is a religious tradition that exists both apart of and apart from history. The Torah, all our literature, our laws, our holidays, our rituals, these elements of our tradition exist above history. No matter how many centuries go by, that scroll doesn't change, and the menorah is still lit, and the Megillah is still read. But what does change? Look around us. Jewish people, we live in history. We are affected by changing times, by technology, by scientific discoveries, by new political and social realities. That is, of course, why Reformed Judaism came into being in the first place, a response to this changing backdrop that we found ourselves in. The Israelites in the book of Exodus counted in their census those individuals who were most able to meet and face the greatest challenges of their day, and in their day, it was a military battle. The people who counted in this week's Torah portion were those who could help the Jewish people to survive and thrive. In biblical times, the greatest challenge was military, and so you had to be able to fight, 20 years old and a man. In our day, in America, in Memphis, that is not the greatest challenge that we face as Jews. The greatest challenge to our Jewish community, the greatest threat to our survival as a Reformed Jewish community especially, I believe, is apathy. The greatest threat to our Reformed Jewish community is a lack of appreciation that some people feel for the gift of being Jewish. The greatest challenge to our Reformed Jewish community is perhaps our own forgetfulness that we need each other as a community, that we're responsible for each other and each other's Jewish identities, that we're building something together here, and that each one of us has a role to play. So who gets counted in our census if we're modeling it after the one in the book of Exodus? Not the fighters, I think, but the lovers. We count the people who can fight apathy and who can fight complacency. Those who are counted among the most important assets in our Israelite community are those who care, are those who take the time to appreciate what it means to have a Jewish identity, are those who are willing to pick up your sword and your shield and stand your ground on this changing field. But of course, our swords and shields are not metal. Our swords and shields are made of something else. Our shield against this onslaught of apathy that we are surrounded with in this Jewish world, and this onslaught of forgetfulness, is the fortification of community living. We are guarded by each other in this congregation, each one of us reminding his or her fellow that we're a part of something bigger than perhaps me and my momentary concerns. And what is our sword? What is our proactive protective tool? I believe it is our own personal engagement with Torah and our willingness to share it. We fight apathy by caring. We fight complacency with passion. We fight selfishness with open-hearted giving of ourselves. We fight ignorance with learning. We Reformed Jews are on the front lines of this struggle because we affirm many different Jewish lifestyles. We, more than any other Jewish community, are constantly balancing the pulls and tugs of our American identities with our Jewish ones. We place very little communal pressure on each other to live a certain way with regard to Judaism, and that is a value that we hold dear. But we must rely then on each of us rising to his or her highest Jewish ideals. So if we are taking a census, a Reformed Jewish census, our criteria might be the following: not 20-year-old military service, but viewing Jewish identity as a gift to be cherished and not a given. Refusing to accept the apathy toward a holy lifestyle that Judaism presents. Embracing community living and accepting responsibility to enhance each other's Judaism. Engaging in Torah, learning, praying, celebrating, and constantly striving to do and be better. That is the criteria for our census. We must each ask ourselves then if we would be counted. And surely it's a great honor to be counted among the most important assets of our Israelite community, so no wonder it's worth a half a shekel in the Torah. I hope and pray that the amount of counting we do as a community never distracts us from the amount that each one of us counts. I hope and pray that we see ourselves as part of a Jewish story, each one of us having a page to write in that book of Jewish life. I hope and pray that were we to take such a census, each one of us would be proud to be counted among the strongest and bravest of the Israelite nation. And I hope and pray that on this Purim Katan that is ending today, we remember that what we're up against in any age may change: an army, an evil dictator like Haman, or perhaps the most dangerous situation of all, a lack of a clear enemy, which encourages apathy. But our responsibility in every age to stand up and be counted in the census is as eternal as the light on this bema. Shabbat shalom.